In 2018, two scientists asked a question no one wanted to answer. If a civilization existed on Earth millions of years before us, would we ever know? The honest answer disturbed them. Probably not. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Human civilization has existed for roughly 5,000 years. That is a fraction of a second on a cosmic clock. The planet does not preserve its history. It erases it. Tectonic plates grind continents into dust. Mountains rise and vanish. Ocean floors get swallowed back into the mantle every 200 million years. What if we are not the first? When those scientists looked at the geological record, they found something unexpected. 56 million years ago, a massive carbon spike warmed the entire planet. Yet the chemical signature looks almost identical to what our own civilization is leaving right now. 12,800 years ago, something struck the Earth hard enough to freeze the northern hemisphere for over 1,000 years. And exactly when that freeze ended, someone built a temple with 20-ton stones. We were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. The rocks tell a different story. If you enjoy what comes next, hit that like button and subscribe. We begin now. The story we just uncovered sits at the edge of recorded history. But recorded history is almost nothing. It is a thin film on the surface of something so ancient, so vast, that the human mind was never built to hold it. 4,500 million years. That is how long this planet has been spinning. Not 4.5 billion, of 4,500 million. Say it slowly. Let each word land. Most people hear billions, and their brain rounds it off, files it away as simply old. But this is not old. This is a number that swallows everything you have ever known. Complex animals crawled across the seafloor for over 500 million years. Mammals have walked and hunted and died for 200 million years. The great reptiles that ruled this world held their dominion for 165 million years. And us, Homo sapiens, our species emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. Our cities, our farms, our written words, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years old. Picture Earth's history as a single day, 24 hours. The planet forms at midnight. Nothing but molten rock and poison air for most of the morning. And the first simple life appears around 4 in the morning. Complex animals finally show up at 9 in the evening. Dinosaurs rule from around 10:45 at night until just before midnight. And humanity? Everything we have ever built, every empire, every monument, every war, every love letter, every song, all of it happens in the final fraction of a second before the clock strikes 12. Everything we are, compressed into a sliver of time invisible to the naked eye. The Earth is not a museum. It is a machine. This is not a metaphor. It is a description. A museum preserves. A museum keeps careful records. A museum protects the old and fragile things so that someone, someday, can study them. Our planet does the opposite. Consider a library, shelves stretching in every direction, filled with books containing every story ever written. Now, imagine that library has a policy. Every few million years, the oldest books get pulled from the shelves. They are not moved to storage. They are not digitized. They are burned. The ashes are mixed into pulp, and new books are printed on that same material. The library keeps functioning. New stories keep getting written, but the oldest chapters, they become raw material for what comes next. That is our planet's filing system. Mountains that once scraped the sky now exist only as sand on distant beaches. Atmospheres have been poisoned by volcanic fire, rebuilt by patient microscopic life, and poisoned again. Entire categories of creatures have emerged, flourished, dominated, and then vanished so completely that only scattered bones remain. Her life on this planet has nearly ended at least 5 times, 5 mass extinctions, each one wiping the slate almost clean, each one followed by a slow, grinding recovery that took millions of years. And beneath all of this, beneath the mountains and the bones and the ash, the planet keeps grinding. The floor of the ocean seems permanent. It seems like bedrock, something that has always been there, something that will always be there. But the oldest seafloor on Earth is only 200 million years old. Everything older than that is gone, pulled down into the mantle, melted, recycled. The ground beneath the sea does not remember the dinosaurs. The Earth has already eaten that memory. When those ancient reptiles walked the coastal shores of the Jurassic, the seafloor they stepped on was already young, brand new rock, fresh from volcanic ridges. And now, that rock no longer exists. It has been dragged down into the planet's interior, crushed, dissolved, transformed into something unrecognizable. This happens continuously. Right now, as you listen, oceanic plates are sliding beneath continental plates at the rate your fingernails grow, slow enough to ignore, fast enough to erase everything, given time. We do not know what came before. And here is the uncomfortable part. We may never know. The Earth does not keep records. It shreds them. This is not a failure of science. It is not a gap we can fill with better technology or smarter researchers. It is a fundamental property of the planet we live on. The evidence destroys itself. The machine keeps running. The library keeps burning its oldest books. And somewhere in those lost pages, and in those recycled shelves, there might have been something worth remembering. The question is not whether we are looking hard enough. The question is whether there is anything left to find. Something might be worth remembering. Something might have been here before. In 2018, 2 scientists decided to take that question seriously, not as science fiction, not as speculation, as a formal scientific inquiry. Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester, and Gavin Schmidt, the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. These are not fringe thinkers. These are researchers who study planetary systems and climate models for a living. They asked a simple question. What if we are not the first? Not whether an ancient civilization existed. That was not their question. Their question was sharper, yet more surgical. Could we detect one if it had? Would anything remain after tens of millions of years? Is there any test we could run? Any measurement we could take? Any signal we could find? They called it the Silurian Hypothesis. The name comes from a 1970 episode of Doctor Who, featuring intelligent reptiles who ruled the Earth long before humanity arose. Frank and Schmidt chose the name deliberately. They wanted to signal that this was a thought experiment, a way of stress testing our assumptions about the past. Here is how they approached it. They worked backwards. Start with us. Start with human civilization, right now, in this moment. We are leaving marks on this planet. Undeniable marks, measurable marks. We produce 300 million tons of plastic every single year, and that is roughly the weight of every human being on Earth, manufactured in synthetic polymers, dumped into landfills and oceans, scattered across every continent. We have detonated over 2,000 nuclear weapons. Each one scattered radioactive isotopes across the globe, cesium and plutonium signatures that will linger in sediment for thousands of generations. We have reshaped coastlines with concrete and steel. We have acidified the oceans with our exhaust. Since the Industrial Revolution began, we have pumped 580 petagrams of carbon into the atmosphere. A petagram is a billion metric tons. We have added the weight of multiple continents in invisible gas to the air we breathe. These are our fingerprints. This is the signature of human civilization. Frank and Schmidt asked the next question. What happens to those fingerprints over time? Not over centuries, not over millennia, over 50 million years, over 100 million years. What survives? The answer is almost nothing. Our cities will be gone. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, glass shatters and gets ground into sand. The tallest skyscrapers we have ever built will become thin layers of mineral sediment, indistinguishable from natural rock, not monuments. Powder. Our plastic will not survive as plastic. The molecular chains will break down. What might remain is a thin chemical layer in the geological record, a strange concentration of synthetic compounds in one narrow band of stone. Not a landfill, a stain. Our nuclear tests will not leave craters that future geologists can study. The isotopes will decay. And what might remain are faint anomalies in the ratio of certain elements, ratios that are slightly wrong, slightly unusual, detectable only with precise instruments, and only if someone knows what to look for. Our entire civilization, every building, every road, every satellite, every library, every monument, reduced to a few strange lines in the rock. A whisper, not a monument, a trace so faint it could be mistaken for noise. This is what Frank and Schmidt realized. If a technological civilization existed 60 million years ago, or 100 million years ago, or 200 million years ago, It would not leave ruins. It would not leave artifacts. It would not leave anything we would recognize as evidence. It would leave chemistry, sudden spikes in carbon concentration, unusual ratios of certain isotopes, strange distributions of heavy metals, chemical signatures that look almost like natural events. Almost, but not quite. Here is the unsettling part. Frank and Schmidt do not believe an ancient civilization existed. They said so explicitly in their paper. They are not arguing that intelligent reptiles built cities before the dinosaurs. They are not claiming that some lost species discovered fire and industry and space travel. Their point is far more troubling. We have no way to rule it out. Our confidence that we are the first intelligent species on this planet is not based on evidence. It is based on an absence of evidence. And our planet, as we have discussed, is specifically designed to create absences. It recycles its own surface. It swallows its own history. We assume we are first because we have not found anyone else. But what would we even be looking for? What test would we run? What signal would we expect? The answer is chemical scars in ancient rock, sudden shifts in the composition of sediment layers, events that look like something dramatic happened, something fast, something that changed the atmosphere and the oceans in ways that nature alone might not explain. If such evidence exists, it would not look like a city. It would not look like technology. It would look like a geological anomaly, a spike, a shift, a moment in deep time when something changed and then changed back. That is what we should be searching for. Not artifacts, not bones. Lines in stone that do not quite add up. Lines in stone that do not quite add up. That is what we are looking for. But what kind of lines? What would actually survive? And let us be precise about this. After 60 million years, no building stands. After 100 million years, no metal object remains. Bronze corrodes. Iron returns to ore. Aluminum oxidizes into unrecognizable compounds. Glass devitrifies, becoming cloudy and brittle, then crumbling into grains. The hardest alloys we can manufacture today will not outlast the patience of water and oxygen and time. Written records vanish even faster. Paper decomposes within centuries. Stone tablets erode into smooth, blank faces. Digital storage media requires electricity to persist, and even the physical substrates decay. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The library of any civilization from 60 million years ago would be less than dust. It would be atoms, scattered and recycled into new rocks, new plants, and new creatures that would never know what words those atoms once spelled. So what survives? Chemistry survives. Ratios survive. When you burn something, when you release carbon that was locked away for millions of years, you change the proportion of certain isotopes in the atmosphere. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 exist in different ratios depending on their source. Fossil fuels have a distinctive signature. Burn enough of them, and you write that signature into every layer of sediment being laid down during that era. The signature persists long after the flames go out. Nitrogen tells stories too. Industrial agriculture floods the soil with fixed nitrogen. That nitrogen washes into rivers, flows into oceans, settles into seafloor sediment. 100 million years later, and a geologist drilling a core sample would find a narrow band where nitrogen concentrations spike dramatically. She might not know what caused it, but she would know something happened. Synthetic compounds can leave traces. Certain molecules do not exist in nature. If they were produced in enough quantity, fragments of their chemical structure might survive in sediment, in ancient coal deposits, in layers of shale formed from the compacted mud of long-vanished seabeds. Not the molecules themselves, echoes of them, breakdown products, shadows. A whisper, not a shout, a chemical whisper. Here is where the paradox begins. Imagine a civilization that achieved true sustainability. They generated power from wind and sunlight. They built with materials that biodegraded completely. They recycled everything. Yes, they left the atmosphere exactly as they found it. The oceans pristine, the soil untouched. They lived for 10 million years in perfect harmony with their planet. We would never know they existed. Their buildings would decompose by design. Their energy sources would leave no residue. Their careful stewardship would produce no chemical scars, no isotopic spikes, no geological anomalies. They would be invisible to us, completely invisible. 100 million years of advanced civilization erased by its own virtue. Virtue, in deep time, is indistinguishable from non-existence. The only civilizations we could possibly detect are the ones that damaged their world, the ones that burned through stored carbon, the ones that poisoned their atmosphere, the ones that left a mark because leaving a mark requires breaking something. But here is the second half of the paradox. That mark, that scar, that chemical signature of industrial destruction. What does it look like? It looks exactly like a volcano. A massive volcanic event releases carbon that was locked in rock. It floods the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. It raises global temperatures. It acidifies the oceans. It kills species by the thousands. And it writes a sharp spike into the geological record, a sudden shift in carbon isotopes, a narrow band of unusual chemistry, a moment when everything changed. A dying civilization that burned through its fossil fuels in a frenzy of growth would produce the same signature, the same carbon spike, the same temperature rise, the same acidification, the same mass extinction. The geological record would show a catastrophe, and it would not show whether that catastrophe was natural or artificial. Picture a haystack stretching to the horizon. Somewhere in that haystack is a needle. You need to find it, but the needle is made of hay, the same color, the same texture, the same material as everything around it. You cannot see it. You cannot feel it. The only way to find it is to examine every single strand and hope that one of them is slightly different in some way you cannot predict. That is what searching for an ancient civilization looks like. If they were sustainable, they vanished without a trace. If they were destructive, their trace looks exactly like nature destroying itself. Either way, we cannot see them. The evidence hides behind its own camouflage. A chemical whisper is all that would remain. And chemical whispers sound exactly like the Earth talking to itself. The planet has spoken to itself many times. There are carbon spikes in the geological record. There are sudden warming events. There are moments when the chemistry of the oceans shifted dramatically and species died in waves. Every one of these events has an explanation. Volcanoes, methane releases from the seafloor, orbital variations changing how much sunlight reaches different latitudes, natural processes, all of them, documented, studied, understood. But understood does not mean certain. It means we have a model that fits the data. It means we have a story that explains what we see. It does not mean we can rule out other stories, other explanations, other sources for that carbon. If you wanted to find evidence of an ancient industrial civilization, you would look for exactly what we find in the geological record: a sudden spike in carbon, a rapid warming, an extinction event. You would look for a moment when something dramatic happened, something that changed the world in ways that took millions of years to recover from, and you would find such moments, several of them. The question is not whether these signatures exist. They do. The question is whether any of them could be something other than what we assume, whether any of them could be artificial, whether any of them could be the final breath of a species that burned too bright and too fast, leaving behind nothing but a scar that looks like nature. There is one event in particular, one carbon spike so massive, so rapid, so out of proportion with anything before or after it. One moment in deep time when the Earth's temperature jumped dramatically and stayed elevated for thousands of years. One geological scar that scientists have studied for decades, proposing theory after theory to explain where all that carbon came from. 60 million years ago, something flooded the atmosphere with more carbon than any known volcanic event could account for. Something changed the planet so completely that the effects lasted for 200,000 years. Something happened that we still do not fully understand. The evidence is there, buried in rock, written in chemistry, a whisper from deep time. The question is what it is trying to tell us. The scar has a name. Scientists call it the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the PETM. It sits in the geological record like a burn mark on ancient paper. Of 56 million years old, not 60 million, 56. We can date it precisely because the chemistry is so dramatic, so sudden, so unlike anything that came before or after. Here is what we know happened. In a window of time lasting somewhere between 6,000 and 20,000 years, something released a staggering amount of carbon into Earth's atmosphere. The estimates vary because the event was so extreme that models struggle to capture it. Conservative calculations suggest 3,000 petagrams. More aggressive readings push that number above 13,000 petagrams. Those numbers mean nothing without context. A petagram is 1 billion metric tons. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, humanity has released roughly 580 petagrams of carbon. All of it, every coal plant, every car, every factory, every flight, every furnace burning through every winter for over 2 centuries. 580 petagrams. The PETM released at minimum 5 times that amount, possibly more than 20 times. In a geological instant, the planet responded exactly as you would expect. Global temperatures climbed between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. That sounds modest if you are thinking about weather. This was not weather. This was the operating temperature of the entire planet, shifting upward and staying there. The Arctic Ocean warmed to 23 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that is 73 degrees. Warm enough to swim in comfortably, the Arctic became a bath, not a frozen wasteland, a warm, shallow sea where you could wade in without discomfort. Crocodiles lived above the Arctic Circle during this period. We have found their fossils. They were not lost. They were thriving. The ocean surface off the coast of West Africa reached 36 degrees Celsius. That is 97 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly body temperature. Imagine wading into water that feels like your own blood, warm and thick and wrong. Life in those waters struggled to survive. Oxygen dissolved poorly in water that hot. The deep oceans suffocated. Palm trees grew in Antarctica. The world was an entirely different planet. Not marginally different, fundamentally transformed. The chemistry of the oceans shifted toward acid. Shellfish died in waves as their calcium shells dissolved. Species that had flourished for millions of years vanished. The event lasted roughly 200,000 years from onset to full recovery. All of this is documented, measured, confirmed by decades of research across multiple scientific disciplines. The PETM is not speculation. It is one of the most studied climatic events in Earth's history. The question is what caused it. Volcanoes are the leading theory. A massive volcanic province in the North Atlantic was active during this period. Eruptions could have released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide directly into the atmosphere. It fits, mostly. Methane hydrates are another suspect. A frozen methane trapped in seafloor sediments can destabilize when ocean temperatures rise. If something warmed the deep ocean, even slightly, vast reserves of methane could have bubbled up and entered the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It would have amplified any initial warming into a runaway event. Both explanations are reasonable. Both have supporting evidence. Neither fully accounts for the scale and speed of what happened. Actually, let me be clear here. The scientists who proposed this are not saying an ancient civilization caused the PETM. They are saying something far more unsettling. They are saying we could not tell if one had. Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank examined the evidence carefully. They looked at the carbon isotope ratios. They looked at the temperature curves. They looked at the acidification markers. And they concluded that if a civilization had existed 56 million years ago and burned fossil fuels on an industrial scale, the geological signature would be indistinguishable from what we see. Indistinguishable. Not similar. Not close. Identical. Finding the PETM carbon spike is like finding a receipt from a party thrown 56 million years ago. You know something happened. You can see the evidence. Empty bottles, stains on the floor, the lingering smell of smoke, but the guests are long gone, and you cannot tell if they were human or volcanic. The receipt does not specify who paid. This is the core of the Silurian Hypothesis. Not that there was a civilization before us. The scientists do not believe there was. The point is that we have no way to rule it out. The very evidence we would use to detect an ancient industrial species looks exactly like the evidence we find. A civilization that burned through its resources in a geological eye blink would leave behind exactly this signature: rapid carbon release, temperature spike, ocean acidification, mass extinction, recovery over hundreds of thousands of years. We see all of these things in the PETM. We see them in our own future projections too. The uncomfortable symmetry is what haunts the hypothesis. We are doing right now what something did 56 million years ago. We are releasing carbon at rates the planet has not experienced since that ancient event. We are watching temperatures climb. We are measuring ocean acidity increasing. If we vanished tomorrow, and the planet recovered over the next few 100,000 years, and some future intelligence examined the rocks, they would find our signature. They would debate whether it was volcanic activity or industrial civilization. They would never know for certain, just as we do not know for certain about the PETM. Volcanism likely caused it. Methane release probably accelerated it. Natural processes almost certainly explain every data point. Almost certainly. But the gap between almost certainly and definitely is wide enough to lose a civilization inside. This is the deepest scar in the record that matches the fingerprint we are leaving. 56 million years down, burned into stone, written in chemistry no human hand could have made. It is also not the only one. How do we know any of this? That is a fair question. We have been talking about events that happened before humans existed, before primates existed, before anything with a spine crawled out of the ocean. We have been describing temperatures and carbon levels and chemical signatures from an era so distant that the continents had not yet drifted into their current positions. So how can anyone claim to read the atmosphere of a world that vanished tens of millions of years before the first ape looked up at the sky? The answer lives in shells, in stone, in the bones of creatures that died when dinosaurs were still a fresh memory. Carbon is not just carbon. The atoms we call carbon come in different flavors, different weights. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12, but some carbon atoms carry an extra neutron. That makes them carbon-13. Both are stable. Both exist in nature. But living things are picky, and when an organism pulls carbon from its environment to build its body, it prefers the lighter version. Carbon-12 moves through cell membranes more easily. It reacts more readily in biological processes. Life is lazy in this way. It takes what requires less energy. This preference creates a signature. Living tissue contains slightly more carbon-12 than the surrounding environment. When massive amounts of organic carbon enter the atmosphere, that preference shows up in the ratio between the two isotopes. The balance shifts. The scale tips toward the lighter form. And here is what matters. That shift gets recorded. The Earth is not a museum. It is a machine. But some parts of the machine preserve information before grinding it away. Tiny creatures called foraminifera drift through the ocean by the trillions. Each one builds a shell from calcium carbonate, pulling carbon and oxygen from the water around it. When the creature dies, the shell sinks. It lands on the seafloor and joins countless others in layers of sediment that compress over millions of years into stone. Each shell is a time capsule. The carbon in that shell reflects the chemistry of the ocean when the creature was alive. The oxygen tells us water temperature. Together, these isotopes preserve a record of conditions that vanished eons ago. Imagine a library where every book writes itself. Each tiny shell is a page, recording the state of the world during a single brief lifetime. Stack enough pages together and you get a chronicle spanning millions of years. Scientists can drill into ancient seafloor sediments and pull up cores that contain thousands of these pages, are layered in order from oldest at the bottom to youngest at the top. This is how we read the rocks, not by guessing, not by assuming, by measuring the atoms in the shells of creatures that lived and died in waters that no longer exist. Dating these layers requires its own set of tools. Certain radioactive elements decay at predictable rates. By measuring how much of a parent element remains and how much has transformed into its daughter element, scientists can calculate when a rock formed. Cross-reference this with other markers. Certain asteroid impacts left distinctive debris around the entire planet. Magnetic pole reversals created global patterns that can be matched across continents. These events become reference points, anchoring the timeline. When scientists examined the sediment layers from 56 million years ago, they found something striking. The carbon-13 ratio dropped sharply. This negative excursion, as they call it, appears in rocks from every ocean basin on the planet. It shows up in the shells of deep-sea foraminifera. It appears in the teeth of mammals that roamed ancient forests. It marks the same moment everywhere on Earth. A drop in carbon-13 means a sudden influx of carbon-12. It means something released enormous quantities of organic carbon into the atmosphere. Something biological. Something that had been locked away. Volcanic eruptions release carbon too, but volcanic carbon has a different signature. It comes from deep in the mantle, where the ratio of isotopes reflects primordial conditions rather than biological processes. The carbon spike from 56 million years ago carries a biological fingerprint, and it points to carbon that was once part of living things: fossil fuels, methane hydrates frozen on the seafloor, organic matter buried for millions of years and suddenly released. Here is the part that troubles the scientists. Volcanic outgassing is slow. The mantle releases carbon over hundreds of thousands of years. The atmosphere has time to adjust. The oceans absorb and buffer. Temperature rises gradually. But the spike from 56 million years ago was not gradual. The sediment record shows it happened in less than 20,000 years, probably faster. Some estimates suggest the main pulse occurred in under 10,000 years. On a geological scale, that is not a slow leak. That is a rupture. Normal volcanic processes cannot explain that speed. The carbon entered the system too quickly. Something triggered a rapid release. Perhaps volcanic activity destabilized methane hydrates on the continental shelves. Perhaps a meteor impact ignited vast deposits of organic carbon. Perhaps something else entirely. The isotope ratios do not tell us the cause. They only tell us what happened. Carbon flooded the atmosphere. The planet warmed. The oceans acidified. And then, over the next 200,000 years, the system slowly recovered. When scientists drill into those ancient sediments, they are pulling up the evidence of a catastrophe no one witnessed. They are reading a story written in atoms. The shells of creatures smaller than a grain of sand preserve information that would otherwise be lost forever. This is how we know what we know, not through speculation, through chemistry, and through the patient accumulation of data points extracted from stone. The isotope ratios are not opinions. They are measurements. They can be replicated. They can be verified. And they tell us that 56 million years ago, something released carbon faster than any known natural process should allow. The scar remains in the rock. The signature persists in shells buried beneath miles of water and sediment. Whatever caused it left no other trace. No ruins, no artifacts, no bones that do not belong. Only the chemistry. Only the shift in ratios that says something happened here. Something fast. Something enormous. That is the oldest event we have found that matches the fingerprint we are leaving right now. But the geological record holds other anomalies. Other moments where the data does not quite fit the standard explanations. And one of them is much, much closer to our own time. The Earth was warming. 12,800 years ago, the ice sheets that had covered much of North America were finally retreating. Glaciers that had stood for tens of thousands of years were melting back toward the poles. Forests crept northward into territory that had been frozen tundra. The world was thawing. Then, something happened. Within a few decades, the warming stopped, reversed. Temperatures in Greenland plummeted 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Not over centuries, not over millennia, within a single human lifetime. Picture this. You are born into a world that is getting warmer every year. Your parents remember harsher winters, longer freezes. But by the time you reach adulthood, the summers stretch longer. Rivers flow where ice once stood. Game animals move into new territories. The future looks gentle. Then your children are born into a different world entirely. The cold returns with a vengeance that has no name. Snow falls in months when flowers should bloom. The rivers freeze solid again. The animals begin to die. And the cold does not lift. Not in your lifetime. Not in your children's lifetime. Not for over 1,200 years. This is the Younger Dryas. It hit like slamming a freezer door on a summer afternoon. One generation knew a warming world. The next knew only ice. 35 genera of large animals went extinct in North America during this period. Mammoths vanished. Mastodons disappeared. Giant ground sloths that had weighed as much as elephants stopped walking the earth. Saber-toothed cats hunted their last prey. American horses died out completely. American camels vanished from a continent they had inhabited for millions of years. These were not marginal species clinging to survival. They were the dominant megafauna of an entire continent. Some had endured dozens of previous ice ages. They had survived warming periods and cooling periods spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Then, in a geological instant, they were gone, and they were not alone. The Clovis people were the most successful human culture in the Americas at that time. They had colonized 2 continents. Their distinctive stone tools appear from coast to coast, from Alaska to Venezuela. They had developed sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to thrive alongside the megafauna. For thousands of years, they were the apex predators of the New World, and then they vanished from the archaeological record. The Clovis people disappeared like a candle flame in a hurricane. There one moment, gone the next, leaving only their distinctive stone tools scattered across a continent they no longer walked. No gradual decline, no slow cultural transformation, just an abrupt end, coinciding precisely with the onset of the freeze. The conventional explanation is water. A massive glacial lake called Lake Agassiz sat over much of modern-day Canada during the Ice Age, held in place by ice dams. When those dams failed, trillions of gallons of fresh water flooded into the Atlantic Ocean. This freshwater pulse disrupted the ocean circulation patterns that carry warm water from the equator to the poles. Without that warmth flowing north, the northern hemisphere froze. The mechanism is sound. The physics works. But not everyone is convinced it explains everything. In 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone and Alan West proposed something different, something that arrives from the sky. They suggested a fragmented comet struck the Earth, not a single impact, but multiple airbursts and collisions across North America, as a disintegrating comet scattered destruction across the continent. The evidence they pointed to was strange. Nanodiamonds in sediment layers precisely dated to the onset of the freeze. Magnetic microspherules that form only under extreme heat. Elevated levels of iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in extraterrestrial objects. Shocked quartz bearing the signature of violent impact. Carbon spherules, widespread soot, all of it concentrated in a thin layer of sediment, or all of it appearing at exactly the same moment across multiple sites. All of it marking the boundary between the warming world and the frozen one. This is the part that gets me. We talk about the Younger Dryas as a climate event, a data point, but it was lived. People watched their world freeze. Animals they had hunted for generations simply stopped existing. Imagine watching your entire ecosystem die in your lifetime. The mainstream narrative tells us these were primitive hunter-gatherers barely surviving on the edge of existence. But that narrative does not quite fit what we find. These people had successfully colonized 2 continents. They crossed land bridges and coastlines spanning thousands of miles. They adapted to environments ranging from tropical forests to Arctic tundra. Yet they developed tool technology sophisticated enough to bring down animals 10 times their size. They lived alongside mammoths and mastodons for thousands of years without driving them to extinction. Then, suddenly, both the people and the animals disappeared together, at the same moment, in the same geological layer. The comet hypothesis remains controversial. Some scientists accept the evidence. Others point to gaps in the data, alternative explanations for the nanodiamonds, questions about the distribution of impact markers. The debate continues in academic journals and conference halls. But one thing is not debated. Something ended the warming. Something triggered a freeze that lasted more than 1,000 years. Something killed 35 genera of animals and erased the most successful human culture on 2 continents from the archaeological record. Whatever it was, it had witnesses. Human beings stood on this planet when it happened. They saw the sky change, or the temperature drop, or both. They watched the world they knew disappear, and some of them survived. The question is what those survivors were capable of, what they knew, what they built, and whether anything they built could have survived the catastrophe that was still unfolding around them. Because 1,200 years is a long time to remember, but it is also a long time to forget. 1,200 years is a long time to remember, but some things survive, not in books, not in language, in stone. 15 kilometers northeast of a city now called Sanliurfa, in modern Turkey, a hilltop rises from the landscape, unremarkable from a distance. Just another mound covered in brush and scattered rocks. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University walked this hill. They noted the broken limestone scattered across the surface. They recorded their findings. Medieval cemetery, they wrote. Probably Byzantine. They moved on. For 3 decades, nobody looked twice. Then, In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site. He saw the same broken stones the earlier team had dismissed, but Schmidt noticed something they had missed. The stones were not random debris. They were not grave markers. They were the tops of massive carved pillars barely visible above the soil. Schmidt began to dig. What emerged from that hilltop rewrote human history. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. It means belly hill in Turkish. The name does not prepare you for what lies beneath. Picture massive T-shaped pillars carved from solid limestone. Some stand 16 feet tall. Individual stones weigh as much as 20 tons. They are arranged in circles, the largest spanning 66 feet across. Dozens of these circles, possibly hundreds, still buried beneath the surface. The pillars are not blank. They carry elaborate carvings: lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, birds with outstretched wings. The images are not crude scratches. They display sophisticated artistry, careful proportion, intentional composition. Someone designed these, someone with skill and vision. Radiocarbon dating placed the construction at 9500 BCE, and that is 11,500 years ago. Let that number settle. When these pillars were erected, the last ice age had barely ended. The younger Dryas freeze, that 1200-year winter, had just released its grip on the northern hemisphere. The world was still recovering from catastrophe. According to every textbook written before this discovery, the people alive at that time were primitive hunter-gatherers. They followed herds. They gathered wild plants. They lived in small bands, constantly moving, barely surviving. They did not build monuments. They could not organize labor forces. They lacked the social complexity to coordinate anything beyond immediate survival. Finding Göbekli Tepe is like discovering a smartphone painted into a medieval manuscript. It simply should not exist in that timeline. Consider what building this site required. First, someone had to imagine it, to conceive of a structure that had never existed, for purposes we still do not fully understand. Then they had to communicate that vision to others, to organize workers, to assign tasks, to coordinate efforts across weeks, months, or possibly years. The limestone had to be quarried from bedrock. 20-ton blocks had to be carved with stone tools. No metal, no bronze, no iron, just flint and obsidian and human hands. Those blocks had to be moved uphill. No wheels, no draft animals, no pulleys that we know of, just rope perhaps, and muscle and determination. Modern cranes struggle with 20-ton loads. These people managed it without hydraulics, without engines, without any technology the textbooks say they possessed. They were supposed to be scratching survival from the dirt. Instead, they were engineering monuments that would stand for millennia. The structure shows careful planning. The circles are oriented deliberately. The pillars are spaced with precision. The carvings follow patterns, repeated motifs across different enclosures. Yet this was not random construction by desperate people between hunts. This was architecture. What if we are not the first? The question returns, but differently now. Not as a geological speculation about chemical signatures and deep time, as an archaeological fact staring us in the face. Here is what makes this stranger. The orthodox sequence of civilization goes like this. First, humans invented agriculture. Reliable food supplies allowed permanent settlements. Settlements became villages, then towns, then cities. Cities required social organization. Social organization produced religion and ritual. Religion and ritual produced temples. Agriculture, then cities, then temples. That was the sequence. That was how civilization worked. Göbekli Tepe demolishes this entirely. 20 miles from this temple site, our archaeologists found something else. The earliest known domesticated wheat, wild einkorn wheat, genetically modified through selective breeding to become the foundation crop of human civilization. Radiocarbon dating placed this domestication at 10,500 years ago. 1,000 years after the temple was built, the temple came first. Religion preceded agriculture. Belief preceded bread. The implications cascade outward. If people gathered to build monuments before they learned to farm, then what drove them to gather? What purpose could be so compelling that hunter-gatherers would abandon their nomadic patterns, organize into labor forces, and construct something this elaborate? Perhaps they were preserving something, recording something, commemorating something that had happened in their recent past. And remember what had just occurred, the Younger Dryas, a catastrophe that froze the Northern Hemisphere for over 1,000 years, a disaster that killed 35 types of large animals and erased human cultures across 2 continents. The generation that built Göbekli Tepe was only a few hundred years removed from that apocalypse. Their grandparents would have remembered. One particular pillar at the site carries carvings that have generated intense speculation. Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone. It depicts a headless human figure, a vulture, a scorpion, and a pattern of symbols that some researchers believe encode astronomical information. A date, perhaps, a record of celestial positions at a specific moment. If the interpretation is correct, the date encoded is 10,950 BCE, and nearly the precise onset of the Younger Dryas, a memorial carved in stone, a warning perhaps, or simply a memory too terrible to forget. Then, something equally strange happened. Around 8,000 BCE, roughly 3,000 years after construction began, Göbekli Tepe was buried, deliberately, systematically. Someone filled the enclosures with rubble and soil. They covered the pillars. They hid the entire site beneath meters of earth. This was not abandonment. Abandoned sites decay naturally. Wind and rain scatter the debris. Vegetation reclaims the stone. What happened at Göbekli Tepe was intentional preservation. Someone wanted this place to survive. They succeeded. The burial protected the carvings from 11,000 years of weathering. It kept the pillars upright when they should have fallen, and it preserved evidence that would otherwise have crumbled to dust. We still do not know who buried it or why. We do not know what rituals occurred within those circles, or what the T-shaped pillars represented. We do not know how hunter-gatherers organized the labor, or what authority commanded their obedience. But we know they did it. The stone does not lie. 11,500 years ago, on a hilltop in Turkey, people who were not supposed to be capable of civilization built something that should not exist, and then they buried it, as if leaving a message for whoever came next. The temple that should not exist exists. The question is what else existed alongside it? What other monuments stood at the end of the Ice Age, in places less fortunate than this hilltop? And because Göbekli Tepe survived only by accident of geography, it sat on high ground. It was buried under soil. But whatever stood at sea level, in the coastal zones where human populations always cluster, would not have been so lucky. The ice was melting, and the ocean was rising. Someone wanted this place to survive. That thought deserves its own space. Because burial is not abandonment. Burial is not neglect. What happened at Göbekli Tepe was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something planned. Picture a community making a choice. They have spent generations at this site. Their ancestors carved these pillars. Their rituals have filled these circles with meaning beyond what we can reconstruct. And now, for reasons we cannot know, they decide to end it. But ending is not enough. They want preservation. So they begin to pack. Think about the labor involved. The circles are massive. The pillars reach toward the sky. To bury them requires moving tons of stone and soil. Not dumping. Packing. The rubble was placed carefully around the carved surfaces. Protective. Gentle, even. Like someone wrapping a precious object before placing it in a chest they never expect to open again. This was a time capsule, sealed with intention. The people who did this knew something we can only guess at. They understood that whatever they were preserving mattered enough to warrant years of effort. They understood that the site needed to outlast them, outlast their children, outlast memory itself. And it worked. The burial kept oxygen away from the limestone. It prevented freeze-thaw cycles from splitting the carvings. And it stopped roots from prying apart the joints. For over 10,000 years, the site waited beneath Turkish soil, invisible, silent, patient. When archaeologists finally uncovered it, the pillars stood as straight as the day they were finished. The animal carvings remained sharp. Details that should have weathered into nothing were still legible. The burial had worked better than any museum preservation technique we have today. Someone understood deep time, not intellectually perhaps, but practically. They knew that surfaces exposed to air would crumble. They knew that protection meant covering. They knew that the future would need this place more than the present did. Who thinks that way? people who have lost something, people who have watched knowledge disappear, people who remember a time before and fear that the time after will forget. Now consider the vulture stone itself. This single pillar carries carvings that have generated more speculation than any other artifact at the site. Vultures circle near the top. A scorpion curves along one edge. Various other creatures populate the surface. And in the center, a figure without a head, a human, perhaps, or something meant to represent one. Some researchers have proposed that these animals are not just animals. They are constellations, star patterns that the builders recognized in their night sky, translated into stone imagery. The scorpion might be Scorpius. The vulture might correspond to another stellar grouping. If this interpretation holds, then the vulture stone becomes something unexpected. An astronomical clock, a record of celestial positions at a specific moment in time, and the date it encodes, according to this theory, is almost exactly when the Younger Dryas began. 1,500 years had passed between that catastrophe and the construction of this temple. 60 human generations, give or take, long enough for the event to become legend, not long enough for it to become myth. The builders would have heard stories from their elders, real stories, accounts passed from parent to child across the centuries. The cold came suddenly, the animals died, the old ways ended, survival required new strategies, new cooperation, new beliefs. If the vulture stone truly marks this date, then we are looking at something profound. A memorial to disaster, a monument to collective trauma, a message carved in astronomical code for whoever might need to understand what happened, or perhaps a warning. The textbooks tell us that civilization developed in a certain order. First came agriculture. Farming created food. Surplus. Surplus allowed some people to stop hunting and start specializing. Specialists built cities. Cities developed religion. Religion produced astronomy as priests tracked sacred calendars. That sequence feels logical. It feels inevitable. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Here, the monument came first. The gathering came first. The need to remember, to worship, to mark something in stone came before anyone planted a deliberate crop. Agriculture developed afterward, possibly because people needed to feed the laborers, possibly because staying in one place forced them to find new food sources. Catastrophe drove religion. Religion drove building. Building drove settlement. Settlement drove farming. The need to remember preceded the need to eat reliably. That reversal changes everything about how we understand human development. We did not build temples because we had spare time after the harvest. We built temples because we had something urgent to preserve, something that could not wait for civilization to develop at its own pace. Trauma accelerates everything. The vulture stone may be humanity's first written history, not in words, in stars. A date encoded in constellation positions, pointing backward to the moment everything changed. Carved by people who wanted their descendants to know, who feared that forgetting would be the final death. They succeeded in preserving the stone. Yet what they could not preserve was context. We do not know their language. We do not know their names. We do not know what rituals they performed within these circles, or what songs they sang, or what prayers they offered to whatever they worshipped. We have only the stone itself, the carvings, the careful burial, the astronomical alignment that may or may not mean what some researchers believe it means, and the location. This matters more than it might seem. Göbekli Tepe sits on high ground, a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, safe from flooding, safe from the rising waters that followed the end of the Ice Age. That was luck, or foresight, or both, because the ice was melting. Glaciers that had locked up water for thousands of years were releasing it back into the oceans. Sea levels were climbing. Our coastlines were retreating, and human populations have always clustered near water. Whatever stood at sea level when this temple was built is gone now, submerged beneath waves that rose for millennia. Any monuments, any carvings, any time capsules that coastal peoples might have created now rest beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. The vulture stone survived because it sat on a mountain. Its message reached us across 11 millennia because geography protected it, but geography did not protect everything. The monuments that survived did so because they sat above the rising waters. The ones that drowned took their secrets with them, but sometimes a monument survives in plain sight, And the mystery it carries is not about what was lost beneath the waves. The mystery is written on its own face. Oh, the great Sphinx of Giza crouches at the edge of the desert. You have seen photographs. You know its shape, a lion's body stretched across the sand, a human head gazing east toward the horizon. For centuries, it has watched the sunrise. The textbooks give us a clear answer about when it was carved. 2500 BCE, the reign of Pharaoh Khafra, the 4th dynasty of Egypt. That makes the Sphinx roughly 4,500 years old. A staggering age, certainly, but a comfortable one. It fits neatly into the timeline of Egyptian civilization. Pyramids, pharaohs, hieroglyphs, everything in its proper place. In 1990, a geologist walked into that neat timeline and asked an uncomfortable question. Robert Schoch taught at Boston University. He specialized in stratigraphy and paleontology. Reading rocks was his profession. John Anthony West, an independent researcher, had invited him to Egypt for a simple reason. West wanted a geologist to look at the Sphinx with fresh eyes, not as an Egyptologist would look at it, not as a tourist would, as someone who reads the language of stone. Schoch looked at the enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx. These are the vertical rock faces that form the pit in which the statue sits, the original quarry from which the bedrock was carved. And on those walls, Schoch saw something that did not match the official story. Deep grooves, vertical channels carved into the limestone, rounded at the bottom, undulating patterns that swept downward from top to base. He recognized those patterns immediately. Any geologist would. Wind erosion writes in horizontal lines. Imagine dragging a pen sideways across paper. The wind carries sand parallel to the ground. It scours surfaces flat. It creates sharp, layered striations that run along the rock face, not down it. Desert monuments across Egypt show exactly this pattern. Millennia of wind have worn them in predictable ways. Water erosion writes differently. It writes vertically. Picture tears running down a face. Rainwater does not move sideways. It falls. It flows downward. And as it flows, it carves channels. Grooves that plunge from high to low. Soft curves where the water pooled and eddied. Deep furrows where centuries of runoff concentrated its force. The Sphinx enclosure shows the second pattern, not the first. The Sphinx sits in the wrong kind of scar. It is dressed for a rainstorm. Yes, standing in a desert that has not seen sustained rain in millennia. Something is wrong with the dates. The Sahara became the desert we know around 5000 BCE. Before that date, a different climate ruled North Africa. The African humid period transformed the region. Regular monsoons swept across the continent. Rivers flowed where sand dunes now stand. Lakes filled basins that are dry today. The land was green. This wet period lasted from roughly 12,000 BCE to 5,000 BCE, 7,000 years of rainfall, 7,000 years during which water fell on the Giza Plateau in quantities sufficient to carve stone. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx match that period, not the dry millennia that followed. If the Sphinx was carved in 2500 BCE, it would have spent its entire existence in desert conditions. Wind erosion only. But the stone tells a different story. The stone says rain. Schoch proposed a radical revision. The core body of the Sphinx may date to somewhere between 9000 and 5000 BCE. Perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier. Not 4,500 years old, possibly twice that, possibly 3 times. Egyptologists pushed back hard. The Sphinx belongs to Khafra, they insisted. The evidence is contextual. The nearby temples, the architectural style, the kingdom that had the labor force to carve such a monument. No earlier culture in Egypt could have produced it. But there is something else, something physical that the textbooks struggle to explain. Look at the Sphinx again. Look at the proportions. The body is massive, a lion stretched nearly 240 feet long. The paws alone extend 50 feet forward. The flanks rise and fall in anatomically precise curves. Whoever carved this body understood lion anatomy, understood scale, understood how to translate a living creature into bedrock. The head is small, disproportionately small. Scholars have measured it carefully. The head should be larger to match the body's scale. Instead, it looks almost pinched, an afterthought perched atop a grander form. One explanation presents itself. The head was recarved. If the original monument was older, if it sat weathering under monsoon rains for thousands of years. A later pharaoh might have found it. A damaged monument from a forgotten age. An opportunity. Recarve the eroded head into your own image. Claim the ancient lion as your own creation. But the body remains. The scars remain. But the face changes. If this is true, then we do not know what the Sphinx originally depicted. We do not know whose face watched the sunrise for those first millennia. We do not know if it was a human face at all. If the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, who carved it? Who was in Egypt, capable of shaping bedrock into monuments at the end of the last ice age? The question sits there, unanswered. The Sphinx stares east, waiting. There is another detail, a piece of astronomical alignment that some researchers find too precise to ignore. Around 10,500 BCE, the constellation Leo would have risen directly in front of the Sphinx at the spring equinox, a lion monument facing a lion constellation, at the exact moment when the sun crossed into a new season. Coincidence, perhaps, or memory encoded in orientation, a message left in the angles of stone. The mainstream view remains unchanged. Khafra built the Sphinx, 2500 BCE, case closed. But the erosion patterns have never been satisfactorily explained away. The proportions have never been resolved, and a handful of geologists continue to insist that stone does not lie. Whatever the truth, the Sphinx represents an echo, a suggestion that sophisticated work happened in unexpected places at unexpected times. And it is not alone. 5 centuries ago, an Ottoman admiral sat in Constantinople and drew a map. On that map, he included coastlines that should have been impossible to know. The Sphinx may guard secrets carved in stone. That map guards secrets drawn in ink. And the map survived because no one knew what they were looking at. 1929. Workers were cataloguing documents in Topkapi Palace, Istanbul. Among the aging papers and forgotten scrolls, they found a fragment of gazelle skin. Painted on it was a map, the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, the Caribbean islands, all rendered with surprising precision. The signature belonged to Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral who had sailed the Mediterranean and compiled charts for the Sultan. He drew this map in 1513. That alone would make it historically interesting. A naval document from the age of exploration, a record of what one man knew about the world half a millennium ago. But Piri Reis included a note. He explained that he had compiled his map from roughly 20 source maps. Some of those sources were contemporary. Others were much older. One, he claimed, came from the age of Alexander the Great. Another was a lost map that Christopher Columbus himself had used to cross the Atlantic. The map became a curiosity. Then, in 1965, it became something else entirely. A professor named Charles Hapgood published a book. He called it Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. His argument was startling. He claimed the Piri Reis map showed the coastline of Antarctica. Not Antarctica as we know it today, Antarctica as it would look without ice. A continent not officially discovered until 1820, 3 centuries after Piri Reis put ink to animal skin. How could an Ottoman admiral draw a landmass no one had seen? Hapgood had an answer. Ancient source maps. Knowledge passed down from a forgotten civilization that had charted the globe when Antarctica was ice-free. The theory captured imaginations. Here was evidence, drawn in ink, that someone had sailed those southern waters in deep antiquity. Someone had measured those coastlines before the ice came. Someone had recorded that knowledge, and fragments of it had trickled down through millennia until an admiral in Constantinople pieced them together without knowing what he held. There is something beautiful about this idea. Knowledge traveling through time like light from a dead star. Each generation copying what the previous generation left behind. Each copyist adding small errors, losing details, and misunderstanding coastlines they had never seen, but sometimes preserving a shape, a curve, a memory of land that the copyist could not verify and did not understand. Ancient maps copying older maps. It resembles a game of telephone played across centuries. The message degrades with each telling. Details blur, names change. But fragments of truth persist. The outline survives even when the meaning is lost. Each copyist becomes a vessel. They carry water from a spring they have never visited. They pour it into the next container, and some spills. Some evaporates. but enough remains to recognize what it once was. The Piri Reis map may be the last echo of a whisper that started long before. That is the romantic version, the version that makes the skin prickle. But science demands more than romance. Her modern ice core data tells a different story about Antarctica. Hapgood believed the continent was ice-free around 4000 BCE, perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier. He imagined map makers walking those shores 6,000 years ago. The ice cores say otherwise. Antarctica has been buried under glaciers for at least 10 million years. Not thousands, millions. The last time anyone could have walked that coastline, our ancestors were still small creatures hiding from predators in African forests. No human has ever seen an ice-free Antarctica. No civilization we could recognize existed when those shores were bare. Hapgood's timeline is not merely wrong, it is impossible. The gap between his claim and the evidence spans millions of years. Whatever the Piri Reis map shows, is it cannot be an accurate depiction of subglacial Antarctica drawn from ancient observation. That should close the case. But something remains. The Piri Reis map is not alone. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers drew southern landmasses with strange consistency. Before Antarctica's discovery, mapmakers sketched something in those empty southern waters. They called it Terra Australis, the southern land. They debated its size, its shape, its habitability. They filled it with imagined creatures and speculative geography. Some of this was theory. Aristotle argued that a southern landmass must exist to balance the northern continents. Mapmakers repeated his logic, drawing land where they believed land should be. Speculation filled the blank spaces. But some of these maps show features that speculation alone does not explain. Coastlines that curve in particular ways, inlets that correspond to real geography, details that a philosopher guessing from pure reason would not include. Whether these details represent genuine fragments of older knowledge, lucky guesses, or our own pattern-seeking minds finding meaning in randomness, we do not know. The maps exist, the anomalies exist, the explanation does not, and now the weight accumulates. A temple that predates agriculture by thousands of years, carved stone pillars in Turkey, deliberately buried by the people who built them, a monument in Egypt wearing the wrong erosion scars, a limestone lion dressed for rainfall in a landscape that has known only sand for millennia. Maps that show coastlines no contemporary explorer had charted. Each anomaly, taken alone, might be explained away. Misinterpretation, a coincidence, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. Scholars have offered alternative explanations for each one. The debates continue in academic journals and conference halls. But taken together, something shifts. These are not scattered random oddities. They cluster around the same period, the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, the moment when the glaciers retreated and the world transformed, the moment when, according to conventional history, humans were just beginning to settle down and plant crops. The temple exists, the erosion exists, the maps exist. Someone carved, someone built, someone drew. The whispers are getting louder. They echo from stone and parchment and the layers of sediment beneath our feet. And they suggest that the story we tell ourselves about our past may be missing chapters. Not lost because they never happened. Lost because the evidence lies in places we have not looked. Beneath the waves, beneath the sand, beneath the earth itself. And there is something else beneath the earth. In a region not far from that ancient temple, someone carved in the opposite direction. Not up into pillars, down into bedrock, deep into the stone, 18 stories below the surface of Cappadocia. The question is not why they built. The question is what they were hiding from. The tunnel did not end. That is what the homeowner discovered in 1963. He was renovating his basement in the town of Derinkuyu, Turkey. He knocked down a wall. Behind it, darkness. A passage leading down into the rock. He followed it. The passage became a room. The room became a corridor. The corridor became a staircase. The staircase descended into a labyrinth, level after level, chamber after chamber. The stone walls smooth and intentional. Someone had carved this. Someone had planned this. He had stumbled into a city. Not a cave system, not a mine. A city, carved downward into volcanic tuff, 85 meters deep, 280 feet, 18 levels of living space, all beneath the surface of the earth. Picture a building in a modern city, one of those glass towers that catches the morning light. 18 stories tall, it holds offices and apartments. Thousands of people move through it daily. Elevators carry them up and down. The building rises against the sky like a statement of human ambition. Now turn that building upside down. I'll push it into the ground. Replace glass with stone. Replace elevators with narrow staircases cut from living rock. Replace the sky above with solid earth pressing down from every direction. That is Derinkuyu, not a basement, not a shelter. A vertical city drilled into the planet itself. An inverted skyscraper where up means toward danger and down means toward safety. The numbers alone are difficult to absorb. This underground complex could shelter 20,000 people, not for hours, not for days, for extended periods, perhaps months, perhaps longer. The city included living quarters, storage rooms, kitchens, wells, ventilation shafts, and spaces for livestock, wine cellars, oil presses, chapels, schools, 20,000 people breathing underground air, 20,000 people eating food stored in stone chambers. 20,000 people waiting. Waiting for what? The ventilation system alone required extraordinary engineering. Air had to flow through 18 levels. Fresh oxygen had to reach the deepest chambers. Stale air had to escape. Without this system, the city would become a tomb within hours. The builders solved this problem. Shafts run from the surface down through the entire complex. The deepest shaft descends the full 85 meters. It also served as a well, providing water to every level. Consider the planning required. You cannot dig 18 stories and then decide you need ventilation. You cannot carve out space for 20,000 and then wonder where the water will come from. Every shaft had to be calculated before the first stone was removed. Every corridor had to connect. Every chamber had to serve a purpose. Yet this was not improvisation. This was architecture. The defensive features are equally deliberate. Massive circular stones, each weighing several hundred pounds, could roll across corridor entrances. These doors sealed from the inside only. An attacker who breached the upper levels would face door after door, each one blocking progress, each one controlled by defenders who knew the layout. Small holes drilled through the doors allowed defenders to strike at anyone trying to break through. The city was designed to be impenetrable from above, and Derinkuyu is not alone. Over 200 underground settlements have been identified across the Cappadocia region. Some are small, just a few rooms connected by tunnels. Others rival Derinkuyu in scale. In 2015, construction workers near the town of Nevşehir discovered another massive complex. This one extends over 100 meters deep, more than 320 feet. It contains over 5 million square feet of space. 5 million square feet, underground, carved by hand into solid rock. The conventional explanation is invasion. The Cappadocia region has seen armies march through for millennia. Hittites, Persians, Romans, Byzantine forces, Arab raiders. The underground cities, we are told, provided refuge during these conflicts. Villages retreated below the surface when enemies approached. They sealed the entrances. They waited until the danger passed. This explanation makes sense. It fits the historical record. It accounts for the defensive features, but it does not account for the depth. Yet you do not dig 18 stories underground to hide from a cavalry raid. You do not build ventilation systems for 20,000 people because you are worried about bandits. You do not spend generations carving 100 meters into bedrock to escape an army that will move on in a few weeks. Armies pass. They conquer or they retreat. They burn villages and march away. They do not wait. They cannot wait. Armies need supply lines. Armies need food and water and momentum. A few levels would suffice against any army, enough to outlast a siege, enough to hide until the soldiers grew bored or ran low on provisions. But 18 levels, 100 meters, space for 20,000 with their animals and their food stores and their water supply. You dig that deep to survive the end of the world, yet you dig that deep when you believe the surface itself will become uninhabitable. Not for days, not for weeks, for months, for years, for however long it takes. The stone doors make sense against soldiers. The depth does not. The ventilation makes sense for temporary refuge. The scale does not. What if we are not the first? What if the people who carved these cities were not hiding from armies at all? What if they were preparing for something their ancestors had survived? Something passed down through generations. A memory of a time when the sky became poison, when the air turned to fire, when the surface offered only death. Somewhere in the cultural memory of this region, someone knew that the earth could protect what the sky would destroy. Someone understood that survival meant going down, far down, and deeper than any invader would follow, deeper than any catastrophe could reach. The knowledge required to build Derinkuyu did not appear from nothing. Skills like these accumulate across generations. Each generation passes what it learned to the next: techniques for cutting stone, methods for calculating airflow, the understanding that volcanic tuff, while soft enough to carve, hardens when exposed to air. This knowledge had to come from somewhere, from someone who had tried before, from someone who had learned what depth was necessary, from someone who remembered why. The cities waited beneath the surface for thousands of years. People lived in them. People hid in them. People forgot why they were really built. The original purpose faded into legend. The practical use for hiding from armies remained, but the depth remained too, a silent testimony to fears far older than any empire, a monument to survival carved by people who understood something we have forgotten. The surface is not always safe. This understanding echoes through the oldest stories humanity tells, stories of fire from heaven, stories of darkness covering the land, stories of a world destroyed and rebuilt. Every culture has them. Every civilization carries these memories. And in those stories, again and again, a warning appears. When the end comes, it comes from above. From above. That phrase echoes through the oldest stories we tell ourselves. Fire from the sky, darkness descending, the wrath of heaven. But there is another story, one that appears even more often, one that spans every continent, every culture, every civilization that left words behind. The waters rose. You have heard this story before. You know its shape even if you do not know its source. A world drowning, a warning ignored, a chosen survivor building a vessel, animals gathered two by two, the old world washed away, a new beginning on the far side of catastrophe. In the Hebrew Bible, his name is Noah. In ancient Sumer, written on clay tablets older than the pyramids, his name is Utnapishtim. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells his story. A god warns him. He builds a boat. He survives when the world goes under. In Hindu tradition, the survivor is Manu. A fish speaks to him. It tells him what is coming. He builds a ship and ties it to a horn that rises from the water. When the flood recedes, he is the last man standing. The Greeks called their survivor Deucalion. Zeus, disgusted with humanity, decides to end them with water. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha float for 9 days in a chest. When land appears again, they throw stones over their shoulders. The stones become people. In China, the hero is Yu the Great. The floodwaters cover the earth. He spends 13 years controlling them, digging channels, building dams. He saves civilization by redirecting what the heavens sent to destroy it. The Norse tell of a different flood, when the giants slay Ymir. The first being, his blood pours out in such volume that it drowns the world. Only 2 survive, hidden in the hollow of a tree. Over 500 distinct flood myths have been catalogued globally. 500, not 5, not 50. 500 separate stories, told by cultures that had no contact with each other. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And they all remember the same thing. The waters rose. Scholars have tried to explain this. Cultural borrowing, they say. One story spreads from mouth to mouth across trade routes and generations. Or perhaps these are psychological metaphors. The flood represents chaos. The ark represents the ego floating on the unconscious. The dove represents hope. Clean, tidy interpretations that fit neatly into academic papers. We do not know if flood myths are ancestral memories or universal psychological archetypes. The honest answer is that we cannot prove it either way. But when 500 cultures tell the same story, I find it harder to dismiss as coincidence. Because here is what we know for certain. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world transformed. Ice sheets that had covered continents for millennia began to collapse. Glaciers that held enough water to reshape geography surrendered their cargo to the sea. Global sea levels rose by over 120 meters. That is 400 feet. A 40-story building laid on its side and pushed beneath the waves. And it happened not in a single catastrophic surge, but in pulses, in lurches, in centuries of slow, grinding loss. Imagine this. Your grandfather fished from a beach. He knew every rock, every current, every place where the fish gathered at dawn. Your father inherited that knowledge, but the beach has moved. It is closer now. The rocks your grandfather knew are underwater. The fishing spots have shifted inland. By the time you are old enough to fish, yet the place where your grandfather stood is lost beneath 10 feet of water. Your children will never know it existed. Flood myths spread across cultures like ripples from a stone dropped in the center of human memory. The ocean rose not in a single wave, but in a slow, generational drowning. Your grandfather's fishing spot becomes your father's coastline, becomes your underwater grave. Layer upon layer of loss, eventually calcifying into myth. This is what really happened. This is what the geological record shows without ambiguity. The coastlines that humans knew during the Ice Age are gone. The continental shelves where communities gathered, where villages formed, where fires burned and children played and elders told stories. All of it swallowed. The Bering Land Bridge, the plains that connected Britain to Europe, the vast lowlands of Southeast Asia, the extended shorelines of every inhabited continent, gone, not destroyed by human hands, drowned by melting ice. And the people who lived there, they did not have calendars or written records. They had stories, stories they told their children, who told their children, who told their children. The waters rose. We built a boat. We survived. Remember. But here is what makes the cross-cultural pattern so strange. It is not just the flood itself that repeats. It is the details. A warning that comes before the disaster. A single family or group chosen to survive. A vessel of some kind, built to weather what is coming. Animals preserved for the new world. The deliberate restart of civilization when the waters recede. If these were purely psychological metaphors, why would they share such specific narrative structure? Why would cultures that never met, that spoke languages with nothing in common, that developed on opposite sides of the planet, why would they all remember a warning, a chosen one, a vessel, a restart? Picture what would have actually happened during the meltwater pulses. Coastal communities would have watched the water creep closer, year by year. The wise ones, the ones who paid attention to the old patterns, would have understood what was coming. They would have prepared. They would have gathered what they needed. They would have moved inland while their neighbors laughed. And then, the ones who prepared would have survived. The ones who dismissed the warnings would have drowned. The survivors would have told their children what happened. They would have said, "Remember, yet remember that we were warned. Remember that we listened. Remember to build a way to escape if it ever happens again." That is not mythology. That is survival wisdom encoded in narrative form. The flood stories are almost universally dismissed as psychological metaphors or cultural borrowing, but the cross-cultural specificity maps suspiciously well onto what would have actually happened to coastal communities during the meltwater pulses. The warnings match, the chosen survivors match, the vessels match, the restart matches, and the places where people lived before the waters rose. The fertile coastlines, the river deltas, the continental shelves teeming with life. If any advanced Ice Age civilization existed, that is where it would have been. Not on mountaintops, not in deserts, on the coasts, where the food was abundant, where travel was easy, where the land met the sea. Those coasts are now under 400 feet of water. Whatever was built there, whatever was learned there, whatever was created and celebrated and lost, it lies beneath the waves, silent, hidden, beyond our reach. The stories survived. The places did not. Somewhere beneath the ocean, on drowned shelves of land that were home to our ancestors, there may be evidence we will never find. Evidence that the flood myths are not just stories. Evidence that they are memories, and distorted by time, filtered through generations, but memories nonetheless. Memories of a world that ended slowly, inexorably, as the waters rose and would not stop rising. We cannot reach that evidence. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but the stories remain. 500 separate tellings of the same impossible truth. The world ended before, and someone survived to tell us about it. The stories survived. The places did not. That sentence should haunt us, because we keep talking about evidence buried deep in stone, chemical signatures locked in ancient sediment, traces hidden beneath millions of years of accumulated rock. But there is a simpler problem, a more immediate barrier. We cannot even look at what happened 12,000 years ago, not because the evidence has been destroyed by time, and because it is underwater. 71% of Earth's surface lies beneath the ocean. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 3/4 of our planet is hidden from us by salt water. We walk around on the smaller portion, the exposed fraction, the part that happened to stay dry when the ice melted and the seas came rushing in. The continental shelves are the shallow extensions of our land masses. They slope gently away from shore, sometimes for dozens of miles, before dropping into the true ocean depths. Today, they lie submerged. But during the Ice Age, when so much water was locked in glaciers, those shelves were dry land, habitable land, the kind of land people would have chosen to live on. Rivers flowed across them, forests grew on them, animals grazed on them. And if anyone was building anything worth building, then they would have built it there. Consider what makes a coast valuable. Fresh water meets salt water. Fish congregate at the boundary. Rivers provide transportation inland. Trade routes converge where ships can anchor. Food is abundant. Travel is easy. Every major civilization we know about grew at the water's edge. Alexandria, Constantinople, Shanghai, New York. We build our greatest cities where the land meets the sea. This is not a modern preference. This is human nature. This is survival logic. You settle where the resources are richest. So imagine a culture that flourished 15,000 years ago. Where would they have lived? Not on mountaintops, not in frozen wastelands, not in scorching deserts. They would have built their homes on the coast. Their harbors would have faced the rising sun, and their markets would have bustled with traders arriving by boat. Their temples would have looked out over calm water. Generation after generation, they would have thrived there. And then the ice began to melt. Imagine watching it happen, not all at once, not dramatically, slowly, year by year, decade by decade. The high tide line creeps a little higher. The beach you played on as a child is now underwater. Your wells begin to taste of salt. The fields where your grandfather planted crops are too soggy to farm. Your ancestors' graves, the ones you visited every spring, the ones where you left offerings and whispered prayers, they disappear beneath the surf. This is not a story. This is what happened to every coastal community on Earth. The water rose. It did not stop rising. And everything that anyone had built on those fertile coastlines vanished under the waves. The Earth is not a museum. It is a machine. We have said this before, but now we must add something. The ocean is part of that machine, part of the erasure system, the same force that draws tourists to beaches and feeds fishing villages and enables global trade. That same ocean has swallowed every trace of whatever existed along the Ice Age coasts. Here is what should trouble us most. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own continental shelves. That is not a metaphor. That is a fact. We have sent spacecraft to photograph the Martian surface in extraordinary detail. We can identify boulders. We can trace ancient riverbeds. We can map the terrain with precision that lets us land rovers in specific locations. But the shallow waters off our own coasts remain largely unstudied. Marine archaeology is difficult. It requires specialized equipment, trained divers, submersibles, sonar systems, funding that almost never materializes. Every expedition costs more than universities can justify. Every dive takes years of planning. So we do not look, not because we are not curious, because looking is nearly impossible. The potential ruins of Ice Age coastal civilizations are not hidden by millions of years of geological transformation. They are not buried beneath mountain ranges. They are not erased by subduction zones. They are sitting just offshore, within swimming distance in some places. Underwater we could theoretically reach, and we have not reached them. We have not catalogued them. We have not even begun to survey them systematically. And the evidence, if it exists, waits in silence, covered by a few hundred feet of seawater, protected by cold and darkness and pressure, preserved perhaps in sediment that has accumulated gently over millennia, but utterly inaccessible to casual investigation. We have mapped the surface of the moon. We have driven robots across another planet. We have photographed galaxies billions of light years away. but the drowned shelves of our own world remain terra incognita, unknown territory, unexplored. Whatever harbors were built there, whatever temples rose there, whatever knowledge was gathered and celebrated and passed down, it sits beneath the waves, patient, silent, waiting for someone to finally look. Maybe nothing is there. Maybe the coastlines held only simple fishing camps, small villages, temporary shelters, in nothing that would qualify as civilization. But we do not know, we cannot know, because we have not looked. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of our limitations, evidence of what we have chosen not to explore, evidence of how much of our own planet remains hidden from us by the most common substance on its surface. Water, simple water, the same substance that fills our glasses and falls from clouds and sustains every living thing. That substance has drawn a curtain across the places where our ancestors might have built their greatest works. The flood myths remember something. Hundreds of cultures, hundreds of separate tellings. They all remember the water rising. They all remember the world being swallowed. Maybe they are remembering this, the slow drowning of everything that came before, the gradual erasure of a world we will never see, the loss that became legend because the evidence sank too deep to confirm. Let us pause here and talk about why this question is so hard to answer. We have been circling the same mystery from different angles. Ancient temples, eroded monuments, cities carved into bedrock, flood stories that span every continent. All of them point towards something before, something lost. But the real problem is not finding evidence. The real problem is that the Earth destroys evidence, constantly, relentlessly, without intention or malice, simply because that is what planets do. The ground beneath your feet is not permanent. It feels solid. It holds up buildings. It carries the weight of everything we have ever made. But it moves, slowly, imperceptibly, over timescales that dwarf every human civilization combined. Beneath the oceans, the seafloor is not static. It spreads outward from volcanic ridges at the center of great basins. Fresh rock rises from the deep mantle, cools, and pushes older rock away. That older rock drifts for millions upon millions of years, and then it reaches the edge of a continent, and it sinks. This is subduction. The edges of oceanic plates slide beneath continental plates. They angle downward into the darkness. They descend into heat so intense that solid rock becomes liquid again. Everything on that seafloor, every layer of sediment, every mineral deposit, every fossil, every chemical signature, all of it melts back into the mantle. All of it becomes raw material for some future eruption, some future mountain, some future rock that will itself be recycled in another 100 million years. The Earth swallows its own history like a snake eating its tail. That image sits with you for a moment, a creature consuming itself, not out of hunger, not out of necessity, just because the loop is the nature of the thing. The planet feeds on its own past, endlessly, without pause. The oldest seafloor anywhere on Earth formed roughly when the first dinosaurs walked. Everything older than that is gone. Not buried, not hidden, gone, melted, reformed, recycled into something unrecognizable. The ground the dinosaurs stood on no longer exists. The stone that held their footprints, the riverbeds where they drank, the coastlines where pterosaurs dove for fish, none of it survives as seafloor. That material has long since descended into the furnace below, and it has been churned and melted and erupted and weathered and eroded and subducted again, perhaps dozens of times. When the dinosaurs ruled, the Atlantic Ocean did not exist. North America and Europe and Africa were pressed together. Then they began to drift apart. A crack formed. Magma rose to fill it, and that crack widened. It is still widening today, by the width of a fingernail each year. Slow, patient, unstoppable. The Himalayas did not exist either. India was an island. It drifted northward across an ancient sea. Then it collided with Asia, and the collision crumpled the Earth's crust upward. The Himalayas are still rising, still growing, still being pushed skyward by the slow violence of continental collision. In another span equal to the one that has already passed, yet the continents will have rearranged themselves into patterns we cannot predict. Oceans will have opened and closed, mountain ranges will have risen and worn away. The Atlantic might close again. New seas might form where deserts stand today, and everything on the current seafloor will have been recycled. The Earth does not keep records. It shreds them. This is not a metaphor for something else. This is the literal mechanical process by which our planet operates. It is a vast recycling machine. It takes everything that settles onto the ocean floor and eventually feeds it back into itself. No exceptions. No preservation beyond a certain window. The window is long by human standards. But by geological standards, it is brief. So what happens to a civilization older than that window? Imagine something existed 100 million years ago. Not simple life. Not bacteria or algae or early fish. Something complex. Something with cities and tools and culture. Something that thought about the stars and wondered about its own origins. Where would the evidence be? Any structures on the seafloor would have been subducted long ago. Any coastal settlements would have been dragged down with them. Even structures built on continents face their own erasure. Wind, water, ice, tectonic uplift and erosion, chemical weathering, biological decay. The Earth has countless mechanisms for grinding things down to nothing. And here is the part that makes this question almost impossible to answer. Even if such a civilization existed, the only possible evidence that might survive would be chemical anomalies in sedimentary rock, unusual ratios of certain elements, strange concentrations of compounds that form only under specific conditions, the kind of fingerprint that industrial activity leaves in the geological record. But those anomalies would look exactly like natural events. A massive volcanic eruption leaves a chemical trace. A meteorite impact leaves a chemical trace. A sudden release of methane from the seafloor leaves a chemical trace. An industrial civilization burning fossil fuels would leave a similar trace. And from 100 million years in the future, looking back, there would be no way to distinguish between them. The signal would be indistinguishable from the noise. This is not a failure of our technology. It is not a limitation we might overcome with better instruments. It is a fundamental property of deep time. Yea, the further back you look, the more everything blurs together. The more every anomaly looks like every other anomaly. The more impossible it becomes to separate intention from accident. The planet recycles. The evidence melts. The record closes. And we are left with questions that cannot be answered by digging deeper or looking harder. Some doors close permanently. Some windows shut and never reopen. Some histories are erased so completely that even asking about them feels like speaking into a void. Our own civilization will face this same fate. Everything we have built, everything we have recorded, everything we believe will endure. Given enough time, it will all be subducted, melted, recycled. Our cities will become magma. Our monuments will become fresh rock on some future seafloor. And that rock will eventually sink beneath some future continent and begin the cycle again. The Earth does not remember. It only recycles. So we have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking what they might have left behind. What clues? What traces? What whispers in the stone? But there is a more unsettling question, a more personal one. What will we leave behind? Turn the lens around. Point it at ourselves. In 50 million years, what evidence will remain that humanity ever existed? We have reshaped this planet in ways no species ever has. We have dammed rivers and redirected their flow. We have carved away mountains and filled in coastlines. We have acidified entire oceans with our exhaust. We have scattered synthetic chemicals across every continent, into every watershed, through every food chain on Earth. And in 50 million years, none of it will matter. Not the way we think it will. Our buildings will be gone. Not crumbled, not ruined, gone. Erased so completely that not even their foundations will remain. The steel will have oxidized and flaked away into nothing. The concrete will have been ground down by water and wind and time until no trace persists. No skyscraper, no bridge, no highway, no monument carved to honor kings or gods or the dead, the Eiffel Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Great Wall, every cathedral and courthouse and gleaming tower of glass. All of it will be less than dust. This is not pessimism. This is geology. So what survives? What actually makes it through 50 million years of erosion and subduction and chemical weathering? A layer, a thin layer in the rock. Future geologists, if they exist, will find it. A strange stratum, a band of unusual chemistry compressed into sediment. They will notice elevated nitrogen levels from our fertilizer runoff. They will detect synthetic compounds that do not occur naturally anywhere in the universe. Plastics, polymers, molecules that could only be manufactured. They will find radioactive anomalies scattered across the globe, isotopes that should not be concentrated in those patterns. The signature of our weapons tests. Over 2,000 nuclear detonations have already scattered their fingerprints across this planet. Those traces will persist, and they will find the carbon. A sharp spike in the carbon isotope ratios. A sudden jump that happened over a geological instant. They will note that something changed very quickly. As something pumped an enormous amount of ancient carbon into the atmosphere in what, to them, will seem like a single moment. That spike is us. That is the sum total of the Industrial Revolution. Of every car and factory and power plant. Of every airplane and cargo ship and air conditioner. All of it compressed into a chemical whisper. Here is the part that gives me pause. In 50 million years, the most durable evidence of human existence might be the concentrated chicken bones in our landfills. We raise over 60 billion chickens per year. Their bones accumulate in specific locations. They fossilize more readily than almost anything else we produce. We will be remembered, if at all, by our garbage. There is a certain poetry to that. We are not carving our names in stone. So we are writing in sand at the edge of an infinite tide. We believe we are permanent. We build monuments precisely because we want to believe they will last. We carve words into marble. We bury time capsules. We launch golden records into space. All of it is an attempt to reach across time, to say we were here, and time will take it all. This brings us to something unexpected. The Silurian Hypothesis was not designed to argue that ancient civilizations existed. That was never the point. Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt proposed it for a different reason entirely. They wanted to force us to confront our own impermanence. They wanted us to realize that our confidence in being unique is based on a kind of evidence that would not survive if we were not unique. Yet we look back and see no trace of industrial civilization in the deep past. We conclude that none existed, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, not when the evidence could not possibly have survived. If another civilization rose and fell 100 million years ago, we would have no way to know. The Earth would have digested every trace. The geological record would have closed like water behind a sinking stone. And the same will happen to us. This is not a tragedy. Or maybe it is. But it is also simply true. The planet does not preserve. It transforms. It recycles. It takes everything we build and everything we are and feeds it back into itself. 50 million years from now, some future intelligence might study that thin chemical layer, and they might puzzle over the nitrogen spike and the synthetic molecules and the radioactive scatter. They might wonder what happened. They might propose theories, but they will never know our names. They will never see our faces. They will never hear our music or read our books or understand what it felt like to be us. They will find only a chemical whisper, a faint trace that something was here, something that burned bright and fast and changed the chemistry of an entire world, and then vanished. That is our legacy. That is what survives. Not our monuments, not our achievements, not our dreams or fears or loves, just a thin layer in the rock, a geological footnote, a mark so faint that whoever finds it will have to squint to see it at all. And even that thin whisper, will eventually be subducted, melted, recycled, fed back into the mantle, transformed into something new. The Earth keeps nothing forever. Not them, not us, not anyone who comes after. We have traveled far together, from the laboratories where scientists first asked an impossible question, through the ancient rock where carbon spikes whisper of vanished heat, past the frozen centuries when the sky fell and the great beasts died. We stood before stone pillars carved by hands that should not have known how. We traced the weathering on a limestone body that may have watched the Sahara turn green, then gold, then dead. We puzzled over maps that knew too much. We descended into cities carved beneath the earth by people preparing for something they could not name. We listened to the flood stories that echo across every culture, every continent, every tongue. None of it proves anything. That is the truth we must sit with now. Every anomaly we have examined has a conventional explanation. Every strange alignment could be coincidence. Every impossible date could be contamination. misreading, wishful thinking. The orthodox timeline of human history remains intact. The textbooks do not need to be rewritten. And yet, what if we are not the first? The question remains, not because we have answered it, but because we have learned something about the asking. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence that the planet is very, very good at cleaning up after itself. The Earth is not a museum. It is a machine, a vast, patient engine of transformation that takes everything built upon its surface and feeds it back into itself. Mountains become sand. Oceans become rock. A rock becomes mantle. Mantle becomes mountain again. The cycle turns. It has always turned. It will turn long after we are gone. If something was here before us, we would not know. That is not speculation. That is geology. The machine does its work too well. 100 million years is enough to erase almost anything. The chemical traces might survive, the isotope ratios, the faint signatures of burning, but the meaning would be lost. The who, the why, the what it felt like to be them. We will be reduced, in the end, to a chemical whisper in the rock. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all anything ever gets. A moment of burning bright. A brief flicker of awareness in a universe that mostly does not notice. And then the slow fade, the long forgetting, the transformation into something else. Yet here is the thought that stays with me. If another civilization existed and was erased, they probably thought they were unique too. They probably looked back at the empty record before them and saw only silence. They probably concluded, as we have concluded, that they were the first minds to wonder about the stars. Certainty is a luxury deep time does not offer. We cannot know what came before. We can only know that the question matters, that the humility it demands is real, that our place in the story is smaller than we imagine, and briefer, and more fragile. Something may have been here before us. Something may come after. The Earth will not remember any of us for long. It will simply continue, turning, transforming, making itself new, and in the silence between civilizations, yet in the long dark between one flicker and the next, the machine keeps working, patient, thorough, indifferent to what it erases. What if we are not the first? We may never know, and that is the most honest answer we can give.